you'll typically see a pretty clear line separating the brain into left and right halves, and then you'll have this third lumpy separate structure that's on the more caudal end of the brain. The portions up here, these are the cerebral cortex, the two halves of the cerebral cortex. So you have the left and right hemispheres. These are the parts of the brain that are responsible for sort of the conscious activity, which includes conscious motion. So, anytime you pick something up, your cerebral cortex is part of that process. This is also where the sort of things that we would call personality and thinking would be found. And as you can tell from this, not a lot going on in a sheep, which is not a big surprise. The structure of the brain, to help pack it into a smaller space, you take advantage of the fact that you can sort of fold it up. The surface area to volume ratio type stuff that we've talked about a little bit in other topics in lecture comes in here. The folds and grooves on the brain produce this pattern, which is a lot more distinct on a human brain, but you can still see a little bit of that on the sheep brain. The parts that bulge upward, which will be the tan areas, those are the gyri, or gyrus is the singular. And then the dark lines correspond to areas where it's a little bit folded inward. That's a sulcus, or sulci is the plural. And again, that lets you cram more neurons into a smaller space. The more neurons you have, the more complicated your behavior can be. Again, sheep don't have a lot of folds. A human brain has a much deeper sulci and much larger bulging gyri, so we have a more complicated brain than you'd find in a sheep, which is not too big of a surprise. The other things excuse me, that we can identify on the external anatomy are going to be the cerebellum, which is this lump of tissue here. On our own brains, the cerebellum is kind of underneath because a human brain is kind of bent 90 degrees, and so the cerebellum is underneath instead of being straight behind. But we have the same structure in our own bodies. This is involved in fine-tuning muscle movements. So for example, learning how to ride a bike or drive a car, at first you're kind of wobbly, and then with practice you get better, or throwing and catching a ball, whatever. The cerebellum is sort of like the DVR of muscle motion. The cortex says, I want to throw this ball, and then the cerebellum pulls up the recording of exactly what muscles you made do that to get a good throw, or not so good, depending on how much practice you've had. So that's any type of muscle movements that get better with practice, the cerebellum tends to be involved. And this is why damage to the cerebellum will cause loss of balance, difficulty walking, and a lot of other problems. It can also affect speech, because while we don't tend to think about it, speech requires very precise muscle motion, and so the cerebellum is involved in that as well. You have an enlarged area you can just barely see. The enlarged part, that's the medulla. We'll see it better on the next view, and then the spinal cord sticks off the back of that. Now those are the things that we can see without manipulating the brain in any sort of significant way. The other things that we have to look at, we have to do a little bit of work. And what we will do for that is we will basically bend the brain and open up to see some of the deeper structures. My glove on so I can do this. So if you lift up the brain so that the spinal cord is facing up off the tray, you gently take the cerebellum and bend it downward. It'll basically look like you're being mooned, and that means you're looking in the right place. There are three structures inside here. The first single structure, that's kind of up and deeper inside, right here. That's the pineal body, or the pineal gland. You should remember this from lecture. This produces melatonin, that hormone that's involved in your day-night cycle that your cell phones and computers are messing up. And so that's the gland that's actually involved in producing that. Below that, you have the structure called the corpora quadrigemina, which literally means the body with four parts, because it has two upper portions and two lower portions. The two upper portions are the superior colliculus. The two lower portions are the inferior colliculus. The superior colliculus is basically responsible for building the visual map of the world that you're seeing right now. So you look and say, oh, that's to my left, that's to my right, that's above me, that's below me, whatever. That's your superior colliculus that lets you do that. Your inferior colliculus does the exact same thing with sound. So you hear a noise, you turn your head, to figure out where it's coming from. That's the inferior colliculus doing that. And when you turn your head to look at a loud noise, the two of them are working together. I almost break my foot every time I do that. I've really got to find a better way to do that. But those two are close together because their function is separate, but they do communicate with one another so that you can make sure that when you hear a loud noise, you can turn and face it right away. Because in the humans, you'd find the same thing. Being very visual, our first goal when we have some loud noise or potentially threatening auditory stimulus is we want to figure out where it's coming from. But even when it's not threatening, if we think it's important, like somebody calls your name when you're out walking across the quad, you start turning your head trying to figure out where it's coming from. Same thing, our brain thinks that's an important stimulus, it wants to pay attention to it, it has to figure out where it's coming from so we can get our eyes on it. That's always our goal. And so those two allow us to do that. Side, we flip it over, we'll see it doesn't have the sort of obvious cerebral cortex type structure because it has a bunch of other things on here that are going on. The first thing you should find on all of these brains, it seemed like all of them had it as I was handing them out, is this sort of white, tough membrane that's attached to the area around the spinal cord. That is the dura mater. There are three membranes that wrap around your brain and spinal cord. They're called the meninges. You've heard of meningitis, I suspect. That's an infection that causes these membranes to get inflamed and put pressure on the brain. It's very dangerous. The dura mater is the outermost of the meninges. And it's dura mater in Latin means tough mother. So it's a very, very sturdy, strong. It helps hold the brain attachment to the skull and keep it from, shifting around too much. Embedded within the dura mater, you will typically find a sort of squashed oval or circular structure. This is going to be the pituitary gland or the hypophysis. That's item number 4 on your list. And the pituitary gland should be familiar to you from topic 13, the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is sometimes called the master control gland because it produces a lot of hormones that regulate the functioning of the other glandular tissue in the body. So for example, it produces thyroid stimulating hormone, which will then stimulate your thyroid to release hormones that affect your metabolism. It produces various hormones like FSH and LH that are involved in affecting your gonads and their functioning. And so all sorts of stuff happen with the pituitary gland. If the pituitary gland doesn't work, then all those other things don't work either. And so there's all sorts of problems that can go along with that sort of thing malfunctioning. The first two things or the earlier things on the list that I sort of skipped over, the olfactory bulbs are going to be up near the closer to the nose region, which will be up here, obviously. They'll be typically they're kind of a squarish or oval piece squashed at the base of the brain. The olfactory means smell. So the olfactory bulbs are involved in detecting, or processing, I should say, information coming from your nose. And so they're involved in your perception of your sense of smell. Interesting thing is that the olfactory bulbs in a sheep are about as large as the olfactory bulbs in a human. However, the human brain overall is much, much larger. And what that means is we have a much crappier sense of smell than a sheep does. So for humans, smell is still very important, but we don't perceive it anywhere near as sensitively as other animals do. Dogs can smell things at levels that even some of our most sensitive chemical sensors can't detect. And dogs are probably sort of experiencing almost time travel. They walk into a room, they can smell things that have been in there for days. They can smell a faint smell, oh, that was here yesterday. They smell a really faint smell, that was here last week. And a really strong smell, that's what's in here right now. So their perception of the world has got to be really different because most of their interaction with the world is through smell. And so they can perceive things in a way that we can't even begin to imagine what it's like. Not that I want to imagine what it's like to be a dog, given all the butt sniffing, but that is an important sense for them. And so their olfactory bulb is much larger than ours is.